Yet, he added. Yet, I agreed. I would have argued, but now I wanted him to be expecting disasters. I have another question for you. His face was still casual. Shoot. Do you really need to go to Seattle this Saturday, or was that just an excuse to get away from saying no to all your admirers? I made a face at the memory. You know, I haven't forgiven you for the Tyler thing yet, I warned him. It's your fault that he's deluded himself into thinking I'm going to prom with him. Oh, he would have found a chance to ask you without me. I just really wanted to watch your face, he chuckled. I would have been angrier if his laughter wasn't so fascinating. If I'd asked you, would you have turned me down? He asked, still laughing to himself. Probably not. Oh. My wife knows the story she's reading. She said the words before I read it. Probably not, I admitted. But I would have canceled later, faked an illness or sprained an ankle. He was puzzled. Why would you do that? I shook my head sadly. You've never seen me in gym, I guess, but I would have thought you would understand. Are you referring to the fact that you can't walk across a flat, stable surface without finding something to trip over? Obviously. That wouldn't be a problem. He was very confident. It's all in the leading. He could see that I was about to protest, and he cut me off. But you never told me. Are you resolved on going to Seattle, or do you mind if we do something different? As long as the we part was in, I didn't care about anything else. I'm open to alternatives, I allowed, but I do have a favor to ask. He looked wary, as he always did when I asked an open-ended question. What? Can I drive? He frowned. Why? Well, mostly because when I told Charlie I was going to Seattle, he specifically asked if I was going alone, and at the time I was. If he asked again, I probably wouldn't lie, but I don't think he will ask again, and leaving my truck at home would just bring up the subject unnecessarily. And also because your driving frightens me. He rolled his eyes. Of all the things about me that could frighten you, you worry about my driving. He shook his head in disgust, but then his eyes were serious again. Won't you want to tell your father that you're spending the day with me? There was an undercurrent to his question that I didn't understand. With Charlie, less is always more. I was definite about that. Where are we going, anyway? The weather will be nice, so I'll be staying out of the public eye, and you can stay with me, if you'd like to. Again, he was leaving the choice up to me. And you'll show me what you meant about the sun? I asked, excited by the idea of unraveling another of the unknowns. Yes, he smiled and then paused. But if you don't want to be alone with me, I'd still rather you didn't go to Seattle by yourself. I shudder to think of the trouble you could find in a city that size. I was miffed. Phoenix is 3 times bigger than Seattle, just in population. In physical size? But apparently, he interrupted me, your number wasn't up in Phoenix, so I'd rather you stayed near me. His eyes did that unfair smoldering thing again. I couldn't argue with the eyes or the motivation, and it was a moot point anyway. As it happens, I don't mind being alone with you. I know, he sighed, brooding. You should tell Charlie, though. Why in the world would I do that? His eyes were suddenly fierce. To give me some small incentive to bring you back. I gulped. But after a moment of thought, I was sure. I think I'll take my chances. He exhaled angrily and looked away. Let's talk about something else, I suggested. What do you want to talk about? He asked. He was still annoyed. I glanced around us, making sure we were well out of anyone's hearing. As I cast my eyes around the room, I caught the eyes of his sister, Alice, staring at me. The others were looking at Edward. I looked away swiftly, back to him, and I asked the first thing that came to mind. Why did you go to that Goat Rocks place last weekend? To hunt? Charlie said it wasn't a good place to hike because of bears. He stared at me as if I was missing something very obvious. Bears? I gasped, and he smirked. You know, bears are not in season, I added sternly, to hide my shock. If you read carefully, the laws only cover hunting with weapons, he informed me. He watched my face with enjoyment as that slowly sank in. Bears, I repeated with difficulty. Grizzly is Emmett's favorite. His voice was still offhand, but his eyes were scrutinizing my reaction. I tried to pull myself together. I said, taking another bite of pizza as an excuse to look down. I chewed slowly, and then took a long drink of Coke without looking up. So, I said after a moment, finally meeting his now anxious gaze, what's your favorite? He raised an eyebrow and the corners of his mouth turned down in disapproval. Mountain lion. Ah, I said in a politically disinterested tone, looking for my soda again. Of course, he said, and his tone mirrored mine, we have to be careful not to impact the environment with injudicious hunting. We try to focus on areas with an overpopulation of predators, ranging as far away as we need. There's always plenty of deer and elk here, and they'll do, but where's the fun in that? He smiled teasingly. Where indeed? I murmured around another bite of pizza. Early spring is Emmett's favorite bear season. They're just coming out of hibernation, so they're more irritable. He smiled at some remembered joke. Nothing more fun than an irritated grizzly bear, I agreed, nodding. He snickered, shaking his head. Tell me what you're really thinking, please. I'm trying to picture it, but I can't, I admitted. How do you hunt a bear without weapons? Oh, we have weapons. He flashed his bright teeth in a brief, threatening smile. I fought back a shiver before it could expose me. Just not the kind they consider when writing hunting laws. If you've ever seen a bear attack on television, you should be able to visualize Emmett hunting. I couldn't stop the next shiver that flashed down my spine. I peeked across the cafeteria toward Emmett, grateful that he wasn't looking my way. The thick bands of muscle that wrapped his arms and torso were somehow even more menacing now. Edward followed my gaze and chuckled. I stared at him, unnerved. Are you like a bear, too? I asked in a low voice. More like the lion, or so they tell me, he said lightly. Perhaps our preferences are indicative. I tried to smile. Perhaps, I repeated. But my mind was filled with opposing images that I couldn't merge together. Is there something I might get to see? Absolutely not. His face turned even whiter than usual, and his eyes were suddenly furious. I leaned back, stunned, and, though I'd never admit it to him, frightened by his reaction. He leaned back as well, folding his arms across his chest. Too scary for me? I asked when I could control my voice again. If that were it, I would take you out tonight, he said, his voice cutting. You need a healthy dose of fear. Nothing could be more beneficial for you. Then why? I pressed, trying to ignore his angry expression. He glared at me for a long minute. Later, he finally said. He was on his feet in one lithe movement. We're going to be late. I glanced around, startled to see that he was right and the cafeteria was nearly vacant. When I was with him, the time and the place were such a muddled blur that I completely lost track of both. I jumped up, grabbing my bag from the back of my chair. Later, then, I agreed. I wouldn't forget. Chapter 11. Complications. Everyone watched us as we walked together to our lab table. I noticed that he no longer angled the chair to sit as far from me as the desk would allow. Instead, he sat quite close beside me, our arms almost touching. Mr. Banner backed into the room then. What superb timing the man had, pulling a tall metal frame on wheels that held a heavy-looking, outdated TV and VCR. A movie day. The lift in the glass atmosphere was almost tangible. Mr. Banner shoved the tape into the reluctant VCR and walked to the wall to turn off the lights. And then, as the room went black, I was suddenly hyper-aware that Edward was sitting less than an inch from me. I was stunned by the unexpected electricity that flowed through me, amazed that it was possible to be more aware of him than I already was.